And also, thank you guys. I shared with Paul yesterday that with adversity, there's always an opportunity. So having, I think one of the challenges the past year or so is to convince all of us to register for our meeting. And amazing, I think for this particular meeting, we have 27 people registered. So
Whoa.
one of the advantage of, registering is we can distribute material like the recorded session to you. So if we can keep that going when we get back to our normal meetings physically, I think that would be wonderful. And I think we are also learning that if we can leverage this kind of technology, we can probably, and I hope, reach more people and help them participate in our meetings. So as I was sharing with Jimmy when we started our conversation this morning, I could foresee perhaps we have our meeting at Nevada State Museum. We'll have 30, 40, 50 people, but we may have another 30, 40 people connecting remotely. I'm so happy today that we have the opportunity to have Angel Poe join us, right?
Yeah.
And another thing we said we wanted to do as an organization is how can we as a chapter reduce our carbon footprints? I was thinking about how, Nathan Pipolo, when he came, perhaps in the future, we can have him do his presentation from Colorado, right? So I think this opportunity has, at least for me, opened up so many possibilities, and it's just a matter of us getting better and better at using this kind of technology. So again, because we are recording this session, if you can, go ahead and mute your microphones. And if you want to, what I have also learned is that if you turn off your camera, you may get a better experience on your end, because a lot of us are probably getting limited in terms of bandwidth at our house. So if you want to do that, that'd be fine too. So today we'll have the chance to talk about 4 things. When we designed this session, there's some of us, Andrea, Kathy, Paul, I'm probably forgetting some people. We want to keep as many elements of our normal meeting as possible. Some we will not be able to do today. For example, one of the things we are not able to do, we're kind of simulating, is to actually get to see each other. So we're getting a chance to perhaps hear each other and share our stories. But the other thing we're not able to do is do our raffle. Maybe we'll figure a way out, a way to do that virtually, but we won't be able to do that. One of the things you guys have done is to put our chapter in a really good financial position. And part of that is the raffle revenue we get at all of our meetings. So we're not going to have that for the month of April, and we won't have it. So I can tell you in the next few slides, we won't be able to do that in May. So if you guys would like to kind of simulate the raffle sales, go ahead and please go to our website and click the donate. And if you normally purchase $10, you can donate $10 if you choose to. So today we'll have announcements. We'll have 1 chapter business to conduct. We typically talk about the bird sightings, and then we'll go into our main presentation. Some announcements. I want to remind people that we're also going to test out a virtual Birds and Beer. It's next Tuesday, 6:30, April 14th. This one, we are not requiring people to sign up. There's a link that's on the chapter calendar for that event. Just click on it and join us. We'll see how that goes. Just make sure, if you're gonna, demonstrate bad behavior, just turn off the camera. Okay. We now have been the museum have told us they are probably going to get people back in the building. That's the current plan, May the 1st. But they have gone ahead and canceled all events for the month of May. So Patrick Donnelly, who's going to from the Center of Biodiversity, who will be who had been scheduled to talk about the Clark County lands bill, he has agreed to do, just like Alex today, the presentation virtually. Something that I will let you guys know in the next chapter members letter is the Great Basin Bird Observatory, GBBO, has been planning for a fundraiser called the All Nevada Birdathon. It's going to be the first 2 weeks of May. We have agreed that we're going to modify that event. We wanted to raise money for the conservation of pinyon jays, which I think the numbers say that the decline has been like 80%. But because of this COVID-19 situation, we suggested, I really pushed that some of the funds that we collect should be devoted or cycled back to our community to help out with this virus in our community. So the board, and we haven't talked about specifically which charities and all that stuff, but we'll have a chance next few weeks to decide. If you guys have particular charities you think you would like us to donate some of the proceeds to, let me know. But instead of going out and doing a lot of bird walks and field trips and all that stuff, well, we decided that people can form me-only team, right? You can go out and do it yourself. And the one I really wanted to promote is set up backyard teams, in your backyard. So I will send out a notice to all you folks, all the people, all chapter members, with instructions and all that stuff for this. The last announcement I want to make, prior to this whole social distancing requirements and really the situation we have, we've been talking about forming an advocacy committee. This Janice Schoen has been really active in wanting to do that. So this is something that's going to be coming up too. Okay. And by the way, if you have questions or something, please go ahead and put those questions in the chat box. And Paul will be monitoring all the questions you may have or comments. And at a particular break in time on these presentations, we'll review your questions and take those opportunities to answer them. Like I said, we have one business to conduct today, and that is the election of our officers. I think it was February, in the February meeting, the nominating committee submitted a slate of officers. The slate of officers that was submitted was Paul Rodriguez for the position of president, Kathy Cosmary for the position of, it's a new position we've created for vice president in the Las Vegas part of our chapter. And this will be a one-year term. And Jimmy Alexander has volunteered to take on a second term as secretary. We have given people the opportunity to submit the nominations for these positions. And as of 2 days ago, there were no other nominations submitted either to the committee in person or via email. So as part of our process of election, we now are trying to do this virtually. We are going to do it virtually. And so we're going to open up to all the people that are on this call. We call the floor for give you the opportunity to nominate yourself, and hopefully not somebody else, to one of these positions. So I'll give you guys a few minutes, and Paul will tell me if anybody has put their name in via the chat box. There's a drum roll, right? I'm counting down.
So far, nobody, Doug. Nothing.
Okay. Angel?
No, nothing to add. I'm great with all those people.
Thank you. Okay, if there are no other nominations from the floor, so as part of our bylaws, what we can declare that the slate that was submitted has been elected by acclamation. So congratulations, Paul, Kathy, and Jimmy. And more importantly, thank you guys so much for stepping up and choosing to put in the time required to really make sure that we as a chapter continue to be successful. Okay, thank you again. And the officers will be installed in May. Any questions? None? Paul, any questions? Come in the chat box.
Nope, just congratulations.
Yes, thank you again.
Jennifer says, congratulations, Paul, Kathy, and Jimmy. Daniel says, yes, thanks, guys. Andrea, congrats all. And CJ says, what is that? Huzzah!
Fantastic. And I continue to ask, and I'm sure you guys will, these officers and other board members can only be successful with your support. But please, 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 I've asked you guys 6 years ago to create, to make this chapter your chapter. So please keep it going. Thank you. Interesting bird sightings in our area. The one I wanted to share with you is the black and white warbler. This is a picture that was taken, I think this was like almost 4 weeks ago, by David Walker. I wanted to talk about this particular species because I think if Alex, it's amazing that this particular, I think, bird, and this was at PAPCO, is probably a bird that somehow didn't finish his migration or whatever all the way south. So probably it's been here almost a month and a half. And the funny thing is, somebody, I think it was Patrick Gaffey, said at Tule Springs, they saw the black and white warbler. I don't think it's this one. So his species is actually migrating through here. So this is one of those outliers. Apparently.
Hey, Doug, can I interrupt you for a sec?
Sure.
Can you make that image bigger? Can you get into the slide mode?
Let me try.
Yeah, we're seeing like multiple slides here. It'd probably be better if you could just get into that slide mode. If not, we'll deal with it. But that's better. Yeah, much better. Thank you. Yeah, thanks.
Okay. So this is one of those things we're starting to observe. That's why I want to share with us, that not every species, bird in the particular species, will behave the same way. This one probably, missed some classes, right? And decided to do something different. But the other thing I wanted to share with you with this particular bird was that we would have expected that. In fact, I think the first time I went out to PAPCO, I couldn't find this bird because I was looking for this bird on the edges of the trees, right? I was expecting, I thought this black and white warbler will behave like other warblers, which was feed on the insects on the edges of the tree branches. But I think it was Zane Marshall shared with me that this particular species of warblers behave differently. They're almost like creepers. This bird was going up and down the trunk and the branches, sometimes upside down. And with that information, I think we were able to find this bird pretty quickly. So that gives you another, kind of tip in terms of when you are looking for a particular species, do your homework and check out their behavior, and that may probably help you be more successful at finding the bird. The second thing about this particular species is that, yeah, it doesn't behave like warblers, but they also don't behave like warblers in terms of their nest. This one, I think, Alex, builds their nest on the bottom of on almost the floor at the trunk of the tree. Okay. So we will never probably around here see their nests, but if you were up in the boreal forest up north, looking for this particular bird in their nest, you have to look on the ground. So that's I think the interesting part of this one. Oh, wrong. I really like this particular photo from David, and the reason for that is because the bird is looking right at us. And I just want to reinforce, we were there with Debbie Rodriguez, Paul Rodriguez, David Walker, and Jody Walker. I really feel that the sighting was especially enriched because people who like Debbie and Paul and Jody, who had not seen these birds before, were able to enjoy this because Jody was actually painting a picture of the bird and the environment and all that. And I think taking what we were there maybe 10, 15 minutes, taking our time to not just say, oh, I saw the bird, but actually discussing it, right? That I think made this sighting really special for me. So again, I encourage you. I think it was Stephen Kay said to us when he made his presentation, our part of the thing we like to do is not just see the bird, a life bird and this new bird ourselves, but to help somebody else experience it also. So I also wanted to give people on this call the opportunity to let the group know, are there other bird sightings you want to share with the group?
Yeah, hi, it's Kathy. Jennifer, Barb, Andrea, and I saw a Wilson snipe out at Sunset Park.
Go.
Wow.
Yeah,
Wow.
yeah, and it was Andrea suggested we'd gone around the lake and out in the desert area. Suggested there was a little like, almost riverway, and sometimes it has water in it, and we should go check it out, and we did. And lo and behold, there was the Wilson snipe right in the water there.
Yeah. Was the bird tied down for you? Alex does that for you, you know?
It had been waiting. It was waiting. No pun intended.
I want to put Andrea on the line, man. I thought that her Harris hawk sighting was amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was fun. We were not expecting that. Trip to Wee Thump, just about ready to leave. Spotted a hawk flying over. I don't know my hawks that well. It took us a few minutes to figure out what it was, but it kindly perched for us. So we got some photos. Don't have one to share today, though. Cool.
And a person who lives around there was telling us that there were probably 4 of the Harris hawks, and these hawks they hunt in packs, and they actually saw them take down a jackrabbit. Oh. And it's been what, 8 years since they've seen the species of hawk in that area. So
Very cool.
Cool, very cool. Anybody else?
I had a northern parula at Pobco the other day. It was a male singing, and I heard it singing and recognized that from my years growing up in Florida. Recognized that song immediately, and it took me some time to find it, but eventually I did get looks at it and got some photographs.
Cool. Now, I would also invite Angel to share with us. She apparently had bought this house with such a wonderful backyard. And they are also right in the middle of spring migration down there, right in San Antonio. And you had some outstanding birds. Just one or two you can share with us?
Sure, yeah. So lately it's been fun. I'm in San Antonio. This is my yard. I don't know if you can see out the window, but I've got a ton of oak trees, the Texas live oak in my yard. And then right behind it, there's a little green space that's more natural with oak, but also hackberries and lots of other native plants. So we've been enjoying the influx of migrating warblers. So in the yard, it's been black and white warblers, Nashville warblers by the like half dozen at a time, which has been pretty cool. Black-throated green warblers, the yellow rump warblers. We get both myrtle and Audubon here, and it's been fun to see them go from really shaggy looking in their molting stage until like yesterday I saw a male in full breeding plumage that was just stunning. It took my breath away. And what's cool is like I feel like yellow rumped warblers, like we take them so for granted because they're so common. So when you do see them in breeding plumage, it's, you know, you realize like, oh wow, this is a really special warbler too. It's gorgeous. So yeah, I've been enjoying that. And then of course there's the downside of having a good yard is I have about 15 white-winged doves that I'm trying to fight off with my dogs every day. I send the dogs into the yard to scare them away. So
Cool.
yeah, it's been great.
Thank you, Angel.
Sure.
And I think just yesterday, Patrick Gaffey said he saw the hooded warbler. So these birds are coming through our area. And again, like the last letter I sent you guys, let's do our best to try to protect them while they're coming through here. Let's at least not stress them out, okay? Thank you again, guys. Alex, you take just introduce Alex. Alex, and not just Alex, but Bird Las Vegas have been such great partners for our chapter. Just about any time we ask for help with walks or events or workshops, these guys have stepped up. They also helped us organize a trip to Alaska last year, and this year we were supposed to this month be heading down to Texas before this virus stopped everything. So Alex and Bird Las Vegas, thank you for being such great partners.
Our pleasure. You make it easy.
So I'm going to get out of my presentation mode.
All right. I think this is where I'm up. Let's see if I remember how to do this. Okay. So I assume everyone's able to hear me. I'm going to go to present now. Paul, I might need your help, possibly, but I think I might be able to figure this out.
Okay, yeah, we see your face now.
Okay, cool. So before I get into presentation mode, where you're not going to be able to see me anymore, at least I believe, I wanted to share some books that I took to Cuba, and then I'll get into presentation mode, and then we'll go from there. And I also wanted to talk a little bit about how this is a new thing for me to be presenting over this type of platform. So that'll be new for me. I'm not going to be able to see everyone's faces and kind of get like visual cues of what people are feeling or thinking as I go from slide to slide or subject to subject. So that's going to be interesting. But the upside of it is I can be here with my roller and doing some stretches and yoga while I do this presentation. So that's kind of cool. So that's the upside of it. And I went to Cuba with another one of my buddies, my roommate, Brandon Miller, one of the guys with Bird Las Vegas. And I've been working with him for a consulting company here in Las Vegas since 2015. And of course, I come and go, but he stayed here and has worked for them ever since that being started in 2015. So he said to me, "Hey, Alex, I have some time off. Could have been back in probably late 2018, early 2019." And he said, "I want to go somewhere for about a week, somewhere close so that I can leave, not be jet lagged when I get back to work." He had a very short amount of time. We were able to figure out that we could go for 2 weeks, and he was suggesting Panama. I said, I'm not really interested in going to Panama. I've been to Panama. I would definitely go again. That's a place you could visit more than once. But I told him I really wanted to go to Cuba. At this point in time, Cuba had opened up more or less to American tourism. And while Fidel Castro was alive, that was near impossible. And then after he died, it became a little bit more easier, especially as President Obama kind of relaxed some regulations there. And that sort of eased the diplomacy between America and Cuba. There's been sort of conjecture as to like how strained that is now that there's a new administration. But from what I can tell, people are still going to Cuba to go bird watching from America without too many issues. And I know that Doug has been to Cuba in the last few years as well. And maybe some of you have as well. So what we did to get to Cuba is we looked at how we would qualify. We wanted to go at a time where we could see all the endemic birds, go when it made sense for work, and go when there would still be a high diversity of birds there. And so that meant going in the wintertime when we would be able to see a lot of the wintering, what we think of as traditionally North American species like the warblers and the vireos and summer tanager, maybe some thrushes. We wanted to go when we could really maximize the amount of species that we could see, in addition to the birds that make Cuba and the West Indies so special. So we're trying to go for bang for a buck there. And we looked through the list of things that we could, the reasons where we could actually go there legally and get into the country. And one of the things that came up was assistance to the Cuban people. That was one of the check boxes you could check to be able to go to Cuba. And that's a really sort of general criteria. But what we interpreted that as was you could go to Cuba if you had the intention of helping the Cuban people in some way. They don't specify how. And we interpreted that as just general tourism. If you go over there and you're spending cash, you're inherently helping the Cuban people. And that wasn't just our interpretation. That is literally what that interpretation is supposed to be interpreted as. So it became a little less daunting once we actually looked a little bit more at what the criteria were for visiting Cuba. And we thought, okay, this is a little less scary. I don't know why they wouldn't just say, just general tourism is okay if you're an American visiting Cuba. That's a little weird. And we were a little apprehensive all the way until we got to Cuba, got into through customs in Havana airport, and we're on our way. Then we could sort of exhale and everything was all good. But we weren't quite sure how that was going to shake out initially. We packed really light. There are a couple books that we used. We printed out some eBird reports to help us figure out where to go. But in terms of actual literature, we took 2 books. We had The Birds of the West Indies. So this is by Princeton, I believe. Yes, Princeton Field Guides. So this would be Puerto Rico, Hispaniola, all the small Greater Antillean Islands, Turks and Caicos, Cuba, obviously Jamaica. It's kind of all encompassing. And it's a very small book as well. It's really just plates and some very small descriptions. Then we took this. This is a fairly new book. It's the Field Guide to the Endemic Birds of Cuba. So this focuses on the birds that are particular to Cuba, but it also does have some information on species endemic, so only found in this particular area, species endemic to the West Indies. So that are found in Cuba. So birds that are only on Cuba or birds that are only in the West Indies that are found in Cuba are encompassed in this book. It's also fairly thin, as you can see. And then what I sort of used for reference, but I did not take on the trip because it's a little bigger and bulkier, is the original Birds of Cuba. And it was done by Arturo Cannell and Orlando Garrido, who are based in Havana, both of them, I believe. So this was sort of the original one that came out in 2000. I think I actually got it as soon as it came out into print. So those were great resources for us to take. eBird, of course, is very, very helpful in their trip reports that you can find online. So now that I've shown you the stuff that I don't have on the slides, I'm going to open up this presentation now, and you're going to not see my face anymore. You'll see these slides. Let's see. You are presenting your screen. So that should be it. I
That
can't.
looks good, Alex. Looks good.
Okay, perfect. Thanks, Paul.
Sure.
Okay. So this slide is, or this presentation is going to be a little bit over 20 slides, and all of them are mine. Doug also sent me some of his photos from his trip. I just chose to leave them out for the sake of time, because I have the tendency to ramble a little bit. So a world 90 miles away. And we all know that Cuba has sort of been isolated from more Western countries, especially the United States, for some time, since the mid 1900s. And it really couldn't be any more different, yet so close to home. And, you know, for me, a lot of you probably know this by now, but I grew up in Miami, Florida, and I have a British biological mother, but my dad and her divorced when I was 7, and a couple years after that divorce, my dad remarried. And growing up in Miami, and you know, him being single and sort of on the market again, the odds were very high he would end up with a Cuban woman, which is what he did. And so my stepmother is a first-generation Cuban American from Miami. And I can't tell you how different it was to have a Cuban stepmother from a very proper English biological mother. But I have had close relationships with both of them. And so this trip for me going to Cuba was rather personal, because Miami is very much an extension of Latin America, and most of the Latin Americans that are in Miami are Cuban, followed by a lot of Dominicans and Puerto Ricans, and then probably Colombians, Venezuelans, and then pretty much every single Latin American country has a pretty strong representation in Miami, but especially Cuba. It's very difficult to go anywhere in Miami and not see some sort of Cuban influence while you're there. So this was sort of an opportunity for me to go and see a little bit of the country that influenced the city that I grew up in, and actually my family too. Just to let you know how Cuban my household was. You know, I have 3 step siblings and a biological brother, but all my step siblings are older. And on Christmas, for instance, we would celebrate Christmas closer to midnight on the 24th. It's called Noche Buena. And we would not celebrate Christmas on Christmas morning. It was always on the 24th, closer to midnight. And that's a very Cuban tradition. And so that's kind of how I grew up. With these Cuban roots, even though if you look at me and you look at my name, you'll be like, there's nothing Cuban about this guy, obviously. But this was a great opportunity for me to go see the homeland of my step family. And Key West is only about 90 miles away from Havana, the main city of Cuba. So very, very close. Here's a geological map of Cuba, just to sort of give you a reference as to like why Cuba is so special compared to the North American fauna and flora, even though you can see how close it is to Florida. So if you look at that map, you'll see the number 1. That is over the island of Cuba, the largest island in the Caribbean. You can see the western side is very close to the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico. And the way that a lot of the Caribbean formed is through tectonic movements. You actually had a lot of the land masses breaking off of northern South America, off of Panama, Costa Rica, parts of Mexico, Belize, Nicaragua, Guatemala. And you had these land masses moving north and east. And when they broke off of those land masses that we know are already very rich in biodiversity, like South America and Central America, places that have a reputation for having such high biodiversity, when those land masses broke off, they took with them a number of birds, mammals, reptiles, amphibians, plants, pretty much any living thing they went with. And as they became isolated and the climates of these particular islands changed, that pushed a lot of these animals and plants to evolve and become endemic to these islands. And so every island you go to, Jamaica, Cuba, Hispaniola, Puerto Rico, and a lot of the smaller islands, they're going to have more of an influence from South America and Central America than they are from the United States and North America, as well as Florida, even though Florida is so close. That really doesn't matter because Florida and Cuba didn't really have any contact at all and still haven't had any contact throughout their geological history. This slide just kind of gives you an idea of the cities and towns of Cuba. You can see that there is quite a bit of sprawl throughout the island. Sort of at the northwestern part of the island, you can see La Habana or Havana. That is the capital, and we all know Havana. And then if you look all the way to the right side, you can see Guantanamo. And we all know Guantanamo as well. But I think for the most part, many of us aren't really familiar with any parts of Cuba other than Havana or Guantanamo. But you can see that those two cities are really far apart. They're just about as far apart as they possibly can be, considering they're on this island. And there are a couple mountain ranges that are on the island as well. And those mountain ranges are mainly on the west side. So you can see the city called Pinar del Rio. It is to the left of Havana there, on the left side of the screen. There's a large mountain range there. And then closer to Guantanamo, all the way on the right-hand side of the map, there's the biggest mountain range on the island is over there. And that is an area that most birders don't actually ever get to because of how far away it is. And there's just kind of less return in terms of the bird species you would get, although I'm sure visiting Guantanamo itself would be really interesting. The town of Guantanamo itself, you can visit, but of course they won't let you into the Guantanamo facility. And then this is a map that shows you the more classic birding routes. And so most people start in Havana and then they will head to the west. They'll head to La Guaira and San Diego de los Baños. They'll head over to there and an area known as the Vinales Valley. From there, they will head to the Zapata Swamp. And you can see that's where there's that bird icon, and then days 3 and 4 and 5. And then most people will head east towards Camagüey, La Haza, and then Cayo Coco before heading to Havana. And so this is just sort of like a suggestion of an itinerary that many people will suggest if you would like to bird Cuba, and they say, okay, spend about 9 days there total. We decided to spend about 12 days total because we were doing traveling on our own and weren't really hiring guides. So we wanted to have ourselves a little bit of flexibility just in case we missed some stuff, or we just wanted to spend an extra day in an area we really liked. And so here, this is where the birding begins. On the left-hand side, you have the author of that book I showed you, The Field Guide to the Endemic Birds of Cuba. That is Nils Navarro, and he is signing Brandon's book. Brandon is in both of these photos. And Nils was very helpful in helping us coordinate our trip because unlike other Latin American countries that I've visited, and I think I've visited 7, 8, or 9 at this point, including Puerto Rico in the Caribbean, I thought that it would be a lot like that. I thought that you would be able to just sort of show up and there would be buses that one could take at any point during the day and be able to travel around really easily. And that's how I've done a lot of traveling in Latin America by myself. And I learned that that just doesn't happen here because resources are so low and things seem to be so inefficient in some ways that it really pays to speak and have a relationship with some of the birders that actually live there, because you can reach them on Facebook Messenger and say, hey, I'm trying to get to these places on these dates, and they will set up rides for you. They will talk to taxi drivers who are going to coordinate a trip for you to get from one birding spot to the next, because that's really the only way that you can do it if you're doing it on your own. It's so difficult to just assume that you can you can just show up and like take public buses anywhere. That just doesn't happen. So Nils was super helpful. He linked us up with this this friend of his on the right-hand side of the screen here, and he took us out birding, and Brandon's probably photographing a Cuban solitaire, and this would have been in Vinales. And this is sort of like the tobacco growing region of Cuba. That would be the west side. And now the birds themselves. In Cuba, there are 26 endemic species. So birds only found on Cuba, there are 26 of them. And we would see 23 for this trip. Neither one of these birds are actually endemics. You have the Cuban parrot, so that suggests that it's probably an endemic species, but a couple of them are actually found in the Bahamas, so technically not an endemic. And then we have the red-legged thrush on the right-hand side, which is ubiquitous throughout the Caribbean. And in the last few years, a couple of them have actually shown up in Florida, in the Miami area. They're starting to sort of make their way into South Florida. It doesn't mean they're colonizing or setting up shop and breeding, but they're showing up with a little bit more frequency than they have in the past. Here's Brandon in front of one of those iconic taxis or cars that now function as a taxi. We're heading from Vinales, our first birding region, all the way to the Zapata area. And we're sharing the taxi with some Italian tourists who really love Fidel Castro. They were obsessed with Fidel Castro. They thought the idea of running a country the way that Fidel Castro ran Cuba, they really were intrigued by that. So they were here to sort of like do a Fidel Castro memorial tour. And a couple of them fell pretty ill, and we pulled over at the side here so that a couple of them could go relieve themselves because they couldn't wait until we found an actual bathroom. But taking taxis like this was a pretty common thing. They're called colectivos down there. So you would arrange with, say, some like a bird watcher from Cuba, or just somebody at a homestay that you might be staying at, to get a ride to wherever you're trying to go. So you'd arrange the night before, you'd agree upon a price, and then you would you would meet your taxi driver, and then the person who set up that taxi ride would get a small commission. So we would stay at these casa particulares, that's what they're called, and they're actually homes that people are opening up sort of like an Airbnb to make cash or make a little extra money. And they were often trying to push arranging a colectivo or a shared taxi ride for you so that they can make a small percentage of that. And those types of small business enterprises are prolific in that country. And they have to be if people want to actually make any money, because the median monthly income is about $25 a month for a regular Cuban. Doctors will make about $50 a month The flip side of that is the healthcare is provided, housing is provided, tickets for food and meals are provided. If there's a baseball game on the island, if you're a Cuban resident, you can go watch that for free. And so there are a lot of services that you can find in Cuba that we wouldn't necessarily get here. But the flip side of that is that disposable income is very rare. So, you know, we stayed with some doctors who told us that they make $50 a month after everything is said and done, after all their taxes. But they really wanted to go visit family that was living in Miami, and they just couldn't afford to do that. So imagine that there were doctors over there that were saying that they felt that it was so difficult to be a Cuban because they couldn't travel to Miami to go see family, and that really puts things kind of in perspective. For most birders that visit Cuba, this is a familiar sight. This is the way to get two birds that are particular to the massive Zapata Swamp that is part of the Zapata Swamp National Park, a massive protected area in the south central part of the island. It reminded me a lot of the Florida Everglades, and there were a lot of plants there that were quite similar to the Everglades. And what one would do is you would go to the national park and get a ride up this dusty road all the way to this tiny little canal looking feature, and then get on these boats, and then these guys would paddle you over to this little viewing area where you could see the Zapata wren, which looks kind of like a fusion between a house wren and a marsh wren, but with a larger tail. And so that's the Zapata wren on the right, and then the Zapata sparrow on the left. And then these two birds are only found on the island. Both of them are really only found in the Zapata Swamp. In the Zapata Swamp, again, the south central part of the island, and that's also where you had the famous Bay of Pigs military campaign between the U.S. and the Cuba that went down very close to this region. This is a Cuban emerald. It is one of only 2 species that are found year-round in Cuba. The Cuban name for this is the zunzun, because they zoom around gardens and any sort of habitat that has flowers on the island. You can find them virtually anywhere, even in Havana downtown. This is another iconic bird of the West Indies. This is a Cuban tody. And the Cuban tody, maybe you can tell this from its shape, but it's actually related closely to the jacamars of Central and South America, which are closely related to kingfishers. So this bird here, which is only about 3.5, 4 inches long, and just kind of flies around catching insects by diving on them, kind of like a kingfisher would dive into a body of water to take a minnow. This little bird is actually related to kingfishers. And there are 4 species of toadies in the world. They are only found in the West Indies, in Hispaniola, Puerto Rico, maybe Jamaica, and Cuba. If you don't know this about Brandon really has an affinity for domesticated animals. If you ever go birding with him anywhere and you see a baby animal of any kind, he's definitely going to take a liking to them. So we ran into all sorts of domesticated animals, including baby goats. And so Brandon on the right is making friends with baby goats, even though this one seems to want to have nothing to do with them. Before this photo was taken, he was spending about 5 minutes petting those baby goats. On the left-hand side, you have Brandon trying to feed a domestic turkey in the Vinales area, the west side of Cuba, where you have a lot of tobacco agriculture. I think those could be tobacco plants behind him, actually. They look kind of like corn, but I think that they must be tobacco plants. And you can see that really crazy limestone feature behind him. That's really unique to the west side of Cuba as well. Those huge, giant limestone karst landforms. These here are Cuban curly-tailed lizards, and Florida being Florida, we have these introduced to Florida as well. I can see this species in my parents' yard just running around there. They're everywhere. But in Cuba, they're native. And something that I also really enjoyed about visiting Cuba was the amount of species that we think of as traditionally ours, birds that we are used to seeing in migration, at least on the East Coast, in Florida and throughout the East. We think of these birds because they breed there as our birds, our North American birds. And maybe that doesn't apply to everyone who's watching this, but I know that like I kind of feel that way or have at times where like, oh, these are just our birds and they're going to leave to kind of go elsewhere for a while. And then our birds are going to come back. But birds like this yellow-throated warbler, they might spend actually the majority of their lives in Cuba or the West Indies or the Yucatan Peninsula. And then they only come back to North America to breed, which is actually kind of a short amount of time if you think about it. The majority of their time is actually spent outside of North America, even though they breed there. So it kind of makes some think about what it means for these to be our birds. You know, these birds don't really know borders. They have no issues flying across the Straits of Florida in one fell swoop. Obviously, they don't land on the water. They are really comfortable doing that crossing, flying from Florida to Cuba, and then from Cuba all the way to maybe northern South America without stopping. And that's quite incredible for a bird that maybe weighs only a few ounces tops. So just sort of something to think about, especially from a conservation standpoint. These birds are kind of fragile in some ways. They're really susceptible to changes that might be going on in the wintering grounds or where they're migrating. So in North America, in the United States or Canada, we can be doing everything right. But just because we're doing everything right here doesn't mean that things are going right for them in the habitat that they need for where they spend the majority of their lives. Back to some endemic species. Still in the area of Zapata and the Bay of Pigs, South Central Cuba, we have the Fernandina's flicker, a very endangered bird that is losing habitat to for ranching and agricultural land purposes. So they're losing a lot of habitat, and so their global population, which is only in Cuba, there are only a couple hundred of them. I think it was 800 total. And then on that same tree is a Cuban subspecies of American kestrel. You might recognize that as being a little different from ours. It has a little bit more blue on the head, blue on the wings, and then that reddish coloration on the back and the tail. And the males here in the United States tend to have a lot more white on them. Okay. This bird is pretty cool because, well, all hummingbirds are cool, but this one is the smallest bird species in the world. It is about 2 to 2¼ inches long. This is the bee hummingbird. And I mentioned that there are 2 species of hummingbirds found in Cuba throughout the year. Of course, they get migratory ruby-throated hummingbirds and the occasional rufous hummingbird, but the zun, the Cuban emerald, and the bee hummingbird are 2 year-round resident hummingbirds of the island. And this is a tiny little guy that you find usually around swamps in Cuba. And so there are some places that you can go and be in the right habitat, but it can be really difficult to find. But if you've traveled to Central or South America or even Southeast Arizona, you know that a lot of the time, the best place to see rare hummingbirds is to go to a property that feeds them with hummingbird feeders. And so we went to a hummingbird feeding station that actually at a hostel, and we were able to see a couple of these. And this male is looking right at us, so the light from the sun is reflecting right off of its gorget, and we're getting a flash of all that rosy pink on its face. Really cool to see the smallest bird in the world. And this is a funky looking bird. This is the national bird of Cuba, the tocororo, or the Cuban trogon. This is a classic example of a bird that is particular to Central and South America. And when Cuba kind of broke off of Central America and started drifting into the Caribbean Sea, isolating itself from the rest of of Central America. The population of trogons trapped on there changed over time, and now we have this. We have the Cuban trogon, and check out that tail. This is another very common bird. You can find them if you find a park even in the fringes of Havana, you might be able to find this bird. Again, that's the Cuban trogon. Outside of the United States, I think that a lot of pigeons and doves get a little bit more credit than they do here. And this is another great example of that. We have the endemic blue-headed quail dove. These were over in the Zapata area, the Bay of Pigs area, South Central Cuba. These are not hard birds to find. Where we went to this restaurant that actually feeds them, so it's kind of like cheating, but still, they were technically wild and not in cages, so we counted them. And a little bit more of the sad side and the reality of birding, kind of anywhere you have the sort of like nuanced or particular conservation issues to that place, that country. And what we have here are some cages with some birds that some of us are familiar with and then maybe not so familiar with. On the left-hand side, you have the Cuban grassquit. This is an endemic species that we actually did not see in the wild because they've been trapped so prolifically that I think most of the individuals of that species are now in cages versus in the wild. That's the Cuban grassquit. And on the right-hand side, you have blue grosbeaks and painted buntings. And those are birds that migrate out of North America and then end up in Cuba or the Caribbean, maybe get trapped and now are in cages singing. And this is a very cultural element to Cubans and a lot of Hispanics in Latin America. The idea of having a male bird that sings really well, that is part of their cultural history. I can say that even my step grandparents owned a lot of birds. They didn't own any birds that were poached, but it is really important to them to have birds in the yard or in the house that are singing. And it comes actually from a place of loving the birds and maybe not understanding, or definitely not understanding, that they're better off outside. But another part to that in Cuba is this is an illegal practice. It's actually illegal to capture birds and keep them, but it is not enforced for some cultural reasons. But also in Cuba, there's so much enforcement and the government has a hand in literally everything, and there's regulation for everything, that people find that they can't make any money. And one of the ways that some young people can make money is by trapping birds, like this younger guy with a Cuban bullfinch. He's taking that somewhere. Maybe it's just his and he's transporting it, or maybe it's actually a bird that he plans on selling. Cuban bullfinch is an endemic species that a lot of people over there really want to own because they're quite aggressive and sing really well. And because of the distrust in the government, or just not really feeling like the government has been fair to them and telling them what they can and can't do, especially when it comes to making money, a lot of younger people ignore these regulations because they can sell a bird for a couple dollars. And in a country where the median income is $25 a month kept, any dollar counts. And so you run into this everywhere where there's so many people trapping these birds and selling them. And it's pretty obvious and it's very sad. But when you're down there, or when I'm down there, I could kind of see why this is going on and why this is a huge problem that doesn't really seem like it's going to change anytime soon. So that was one of the tragic parts to being down there and seeing that relationship that a lot of Cubans have with their natural resources. This is towards the end of the trip. We met this guy on the right-hand side. He's sort of one of those guys that sees these issues going on in Cuba and wants to do something about it. This is our buddy Charlie. We happened to run into him in the wonderful town of Trinidad, and he was an aspiring birder, and he wanted to do a lot in the community, especially with kids. He wanted to start a foundation to help Cuban kids and Cuban families learn about the birds that are found in Cuba and actually do something other than capture them. He was trying to encourage people to learn about them and appreciate them and protect them. And in order to do that, he needed to start a foundation to actually have some organization and some resources. And that's really difficult to do because the Cuban government runs everything. And if they don't find it's important, they're not going to help you out. So he was trying to do this by taking donations. We gave him some money to start off, buy some notebooks and some pencils, pens, anything that he could give to kids to go out and start journaling and recording some of the bird species that they have down there. So he was trying to do something with that. He recognized the huge issues going on down there, was trying to do something. We decided to help him out too. And here we have our last slide. We have Brandon taking photos of probably some gulls way offshore. That lens is way too big to be taking photos of what's right in front of him there. But this is an old coral landform. This is where you had a coral bed that at one time was underwater. And of course, when it was exposed to air for the first time, all the coral died off. And this is what you have now. You just have these big limestone sort of calcium carbonate based formations. So we're just checking that out. That's towards the end of the trip where we felt like we had seen a lot of the birds that we went out to see. We weren't feeling like we were going to see anything that we had missed. We found 23 of 26 endemic species, and we're feeling pretty good. So we spent the remainder of the trip checking out other areas, checking out Havana. You know, had a couple cigars and some rum and just kind of kicked back and checked out Havana and Trinidad and did regular touristy things. So we could take a little break from all the birding. And I forgot to mention this all the way in the very beginning, but I'm going to go all the way up to this slide here. If you look at the very center of this map, you can see the town or the city of Santa Clara. It's sort of in the center, just north of Trinidad and east of Havana. That is where my stepmother's family comes from, a small town outside of there. My step-grandmother and grandfather are still alive. They live in a suburb of Miami called Hialeah, where approximately 92% of the city is of Cuban descent and speaks Spanish primarily over English. They still live there. My step-grandfather, he fled Cuba in 1956, according to my stepmother. He was running away from some gangsters that he owed money to after he sort of gambled away, I believe, a car, and then didn't own up, didn't give the car up that he gambled away, and fled back to the United States in fear. And then he returned in 1958. He met my step-grandmother, and 11 days after meeting, they married, and then they moved to Miami. Forgot to mention that, but that felt like important to add before ending there. And there you have a summary of our 11 days or 12 days birding in Cuba. So I'm going to stop the presentation and return to you guys.
So I think, thank you, Alex. Well, you have collected some questions. So if you wouldn't mind just sharing that with Alex one at a time so Alex can answer those questions.
Okay, so Alex, can you see the questions there in the chat, or do you want me to read them to you?
Let's see. I see. Yeah, I see a question from Andrea.
Yeah, Andrea's got a question, and Kathy's got a question there.
Okay.
And I'd be glad to read them to you if you'd like. So.
I can see that this first question about guides, or if that's not something that has become a source of tourism and income yet. It is a huge source of tourism, and I would recommend hiring a guide if you're down there. And one of the best ways to do that is, so most birders, when they visit there, they will elect to do a package where this is a bona fide tour of Cuba. And that is one of the check boxes that you can check off when you're applying for your visa to go visit the island is you can say that you're going to go there on a cultural tour, and that might be something that Doug did. If you go for that cultural tour, then basically you have a bona fide, legitimate guiding service where somebody picks you up in Havana and they take you all around Cuba. You go see your birds, and then you just kind of end in Havana, and that's the end of the trip, and everything's taken care of. You have had your accommodations taken care of. You've had your transportation taken care of, and that tends to cost more money than a substantial amount more money than what we did. What we did is we went to the guides and said, hey, we're going to take care of our transportation. We're going to take care of our places, but we would like to have a guide for this area on this particular day. They'll give us a quote, and then we can agree to that quote, or we can look elsewhere, and then we'll go out for the morning. We'll pay our guide in cash. We'll tip our guide in cash, and then that's it. So both of them work out really well. If you're trying to get a good sweep of the endemic species of birds or the difficult bird species to find, I would definitely recommend that at least in some of the places you hire local guides at the very minimum. And that is what we did. We got to some places we realized it would be too difficult for us to go find these birds on our own, even with all the resources we had, and we would hire somebody there. So yes, definitely hire a guide to some degree. Yep. A lot of the Cuban birders there are all trying to help them out. They're all trying to bring as much tourism to Cuba as possible. So they're all helping each other out. They're all communicating and saying, communicating to each other over Facebook Messenger, because that's one of the only ways they can communicate and say, hey, somebody's going to be in town in this area. They're looking for these birds. Can you reach them? And then they'll improvise and they'll figure it out. And then things just kind of happen on the fly. But unlike a lot of other places, you're not signing waivers. You're not making any sort of electronic, credit card payments. Everything is just sort of like you show up, you meet somebody, they take you birding, and then that's kind of it.
Great, thanks, Alex. So Kathy would like to know, was the toady difficult to find?
They're just about anywhere in the appropriate habitat, and they really like sort of like the edges of forest or forest interior. I don't think that they were difficult to find, but getting good looks at them did take some time. We had two really good looks of these birds where they weren't obscured, where we could actually, look at them and there wasn't vegetation in the way. But we heard them quite a bit. I would say that most places that we went to, we would at least hear them or get a fleeting glimpse of one. So no, not terribly difficult to find. I would say that if you went to Cuba, you should expect to see them.
Great. And Angel would like to know what area had the highest density of endemic species?
So that the area of Zapata, the Zapata swamp, Zapata, in the south central part of Cuba, near the Bay of Pigs, that area has the highest density of endemic bird species. I think that out of the 26 endemic species that you can find there, probably 18 or 19 of them you can find just there. You would have to go to the west side, Vinales, to see the Cuban solitaire and probably the Cuban grassquit. And then maybe all the way to the east side to find the Cuban kite. That would be in the mountain range closer to Guantanamo. But those are nearly extinct, those kites. And they look a lot like the hook-billed kite. They used to actually be considered the same species, those kites. So you'd have to go all the way east to see them. But the vast majority could just be found in the center, near the Zapata swamp.
Cool. And then Angel has another question. How do you recommend studying, preparing for, or knowing birds when traveling to another country? So what's your method for doing that?
I will be honest, a lot of the times I go in a little bit blind and I sort of figure it out as I go along. Cuba seemed for me, it seemed a little bit easier for me to plan for, because I was already familiar with a lot of the bird species, and Brandon was already familiar with a lot of the bird species because of both of us growing up on the East Coast and me spending most of my life in South Florida. A lot of the bird calls were familiar, so I kind of knew what I was hearing. A lot of times when we're around, I could tell, like, okay, that's a black and white warbler, that's a yellow-throated warbler, and we could just sort of stay on track looking for the stuff that we can't find in North America. What I like to do is I like to search on Google. I'll put like trip reports for Cuba or trip reports for Costa Rica, and I'll look, or birding trip reports for Costa Rica, and then you'll actually get trip reports where people are putting a day-by-day summary of the birds that they looked for and the particular lodges they stayed at and the particular reserves they went to, and even the trails that they took. I think that that's very helpful when planning these types of trips, because you're able to kind of see what you need to be looking for, or you have sort of like a template to follow. And then eBird is also really helpful too, because you can eBird, you can look for checklists of these particular places, and then you can highlight the species that you would be looking for, and get a sense of when they're going to be around. And I think that if you use all those resources kind of in tandem, you can get a sense of when to go, which places to visit, and what species to be looking at where. That's really helpful, I think, for planning a trip to a country that you're not really familiar with.
Yeah, great advice for those that are planning an international trip. Thank you, Alex.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions, folks? I
So
guess
I just want to chime in.
Doug, I think we lost you there.
Yeah.
I don't know what you're saying.
Oh, okay. I just want to share with you, Angel, the advice that that Alex had about looking at other people's, that have been there, their trip reports is really helpful. If you're thinking about Cuba, I know I have my trip report. I know Karen, you're on the line. You probably have your trip report. Caroline, you also been to Cuba, so check around. People have been there, and I think what in the beginning of Alex's presentation, he showed you a route, kind of called a Cuban birding route. That's pretty standard, and like he was saying, you just ran out of time. Most of us never got to the eastern side. I think that is a separate trip. I would also say that you have to budget enough time to get from point A to point B, point A to point B, because the transportation is just not that robust. So even like on a trip that I took where it was totally organized, it was fantastic because we had access to some of the museum resources and all that, but still getting around, and things don't go exactly as planned. We had planned to be at this particular hotel, and a day before we find out that it's not going to happen, right? So I think the way Alex and Brandon went, they got to all the different places, but they worked pretty hard to get the local resources. So, but it's also things are also changing all the time, right? So, I think if you think about next year or year after, there may be more capacity available. So. Okay. Any other questions? Well, if not, Alex, thank you so much for helping us develop this capability. And folks, stay safe. And if I would love to have you give us some feedback in terms of what could we have done better, so that next month, we can incorporate your learnings into our presentation. So thank you so much, Alex.
Thank you, Alex. Really
Thank
appreciate it.
you.
All right. So everybody have a great weekend and stay safe. Okay, bye-bye.
Yeah,
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Yeah, thanks, everyone.
Mhm.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.